The story 1. Clap Clap. One autumn afternoon, a young couple decided to go hiking. They prepared, well, food, water, a map, a compass, everything they thought they'd need for a long trip into the woods. What they didn't know was that this hike would change their lives forever. As the sun began to set and the couple climbed a steep hill, they realized they were lost. The wife, initially only anxious, began to panic. "What do we do now?" she asked her husband, her eyes wide with fear. The husband tried to stay calm, reassuring her. "Don't worry, we'll find our way back. Just stay with me." But hours passed, and the sky turned pitch black. They had no phone, no GPS, and no idea where they were. With no other choice, they kept moving in the dark, the chill of the night biting into their skin. Just as despair began to settle in, they spotted a faint light in the distance. They hurried toward it, soon coming across an old, dilapidated house standing in a clearing. The wooden structure looked like it had been abandoned for years. The roof was missing tiles, and the windows were shattered, jagged glass glinting like teeth in the moonlight. The husband approached the door and knocked, but no one answered. He tried the doorknob. It creaked open slowly, the sound echoing in the silent night. "We should go inside," he said, hesitating but hopeful. They didn't have much choice. Together, they stepped into the crumbling house. Inside, the air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of rot and mildew. The walls were covered in strange graffiti, chaotic, jagged lines and symbols. But one thing stood out. Large red letters scrawled across the wall, repeating the same word over and over: "Die, die, die, die." The couple froze, staring at the words. The husband reached out to touch the wall and recoiled, paint still wet. His stomach churned with unease. Despite their fear, they knew they couldn't leave. Wandering in the forest at night was a death sentence. They climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor and found an old mattress, moth-eaten and stained. They spread out some dusty rugs for warmth and tried to make the best of the situation. Exhausted, they eventually fell asleep. But around midnight, a strange noise woke them both. "Did you hear that?" the wife whispered, clutching his arm. "I think there's someone outside." The husband listened carefully. There was nothing at first. Then, faintly, the sound came again. Something shuffling, dragging across the ground near the house. He got up and walked to the window. The world outside was a sea of blackness, devoid of stars or moonlight. He opened the window, letting in the crisp night air. "Is anyone out there?" he called, his voice trembling. No response. "Let's just go back to sleep," he said, trying to sound confident. But his wife shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. What if they can't speak?" The husband hesitated. Then, swallowing hard, he leaned out of the window and shouted into the void. "If someone's out there, clap once. If not, clap twice." At first, there was only silence. Then, suddenly, clap. A single, loud clap echoed through the night. The husband's blood ran cold. He turned to his wife. "You're right. There's someone out there." He leaned further out the window, his eyes scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. His voice shook as he asked, "Are you the owner of this house?" Clap, clap. "Are you a man?" Clap, clap. "A woman, then?" Clap, clap. The husband felt a chill creeping up his spine. He hesitated before asking, "Are you human?" Clap, clap. His wife gasped, covering her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. The husband could barely swallow the lump in his throat. His voice cracked as he asked, "Are you alone?" Clap, clap. His heart pounded in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing. "One last question," he thought. "How many of you are there?" Clap once for each. Clap, 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 clap. The claps didn't stop. They came faster and louder, overlapping, like a chorus of mocking laughter. The sound filled the house, reverberating off the walls, growing unbearable. "Stop!" his wife screamed, clutching her ears. "Who are they? What do they want?" The husband couldn't answer. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. All he could do was stare into the endless void outside the window, where the clapping came from. Then he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the glass, appearing one by one, as if invisible hands were pressing against the window. And then, for the first time, they heard it. A soft, raspy voice from somewhere in the darkness. "Don't stop clapping." The sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs behind them. Story 2. Tara. The box was filled with rose petals, the photographs scattered across the glass table. 2 candles and the desk lamp bathed the room in a soft, flickering light. Everything was exactly where it should be, just like the first day. A single shift would ruin the delicate balance. The whiskey bottle and the half-empty glass sat precisely where they always had. Everything was perfect. All Vic needed to do was find the right photograph, the one with the image of the rose garden. It didn't take long to find it. From the very beginning, Vic had always placed that particular photo on top of the pile. He stared at it, focusing on her face, Tara's face. In the photo, she was smiling amidst a field of freshly bloomed roses, her beauty radiant and pure. It had been 2.5 years since she passed. Vic leaned back into the sofa, closing his eyes, waiting. And then it began again. The entire room filled with the scent of her. The first time this had happened, Vic had opened his eyes right away, and the smell had vanished. But this time, he didn't. There was a faint sound of footsteps on the carpet, drawing nearer. The weight of someone sitting beside him on the sofa. Normally, this was where everything would end. Vic could never resist the urge to open his eyes. But tonight, he didn't. Tara was here. A cold hand gently brushed against his, wrapping around it. He shook his head softly, trying to resist the temptation, forcing himself not to open his eyes. "I miss you so much," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. From somewhere, a voice broke through, sharp and terrified. Tara's voice. "Open your eyes, Vic," she screamed, her voice trembling with fear. "Open your eyes and run. That's not me." Vic jerked his eyes open, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath caught, and he screamed out loud, his body shaking uncontrollably. The room was empty. The sofa beside him was vacant. The air was still, but the scent, it lingered. That unmistakable fragrance of roses. His eyes darted around the room. Nothing. The photographs on the table, the flickering candles, the whiskey bottle. All of it was exactly as he had left it. But the sensation remained, like someone, was watching him. He stood up, trembling. The faint scent of Tara's perfume intensified, surrounding him. He knew something was horribly wrong. That voice, had it really been her? No. The terror in her words had been too real, too urgent. Whatever had sat next to him wasn't Tara. But if it wasn't her, who was it? A soft whisper came from behind him. "You shouldn't have opened your eyes, Vic." He spun around, but no one was there. The room seemed to darken, the flickering candles casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. The air grew thick, stifling. Vic's hands were clammy, his chest tight. He could barely breathe, his thoughts muddled by the overwhelming fear that gripped him. The photo, Tara, the roses. Everything in him screamed to run, but his legs refused to move. Vic? The voice, again. It was her, wasn't it? He turned slowly, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Tara was standing in the doorway, but something was different about her. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, as if she had been running. But there was no warmth in her eyes, only an emptiness, a void that pulled at his very soul. "No," Vic whispered. "It's not you." She stepped forward. The smile that had once been so gentle now twisted into something grotesque. "You thought you could bring me back, didn't you?" Tara's voice was cold, the words laced with a mocking tone. "You wanted to see me again. You couldn't stand to let me go." Vic staggered backward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Tara, please." But she took another step closer, her movements jerky, unnatural, as if her limbs were moving against her will. "You should have listened to me, Vic," the voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't Tara's. The voice was deeper, distorted, and from the shadows, A figure stepped forward, a dark silhouette with piercing red eyes. Vic froze. His pulse thundered in his ears. The figure in the doorway wasn't Tara. Not by any means. It was something else entirely. Something that had been using her voice, using her face, using everything he remembered to torment him. "Tara is gone," the figure said, its voice smooth, like the hiss of a serpent. "But her memories, her essence, they are mine now. And so are you." Vic's blood ran cold. The last thing he saw was Tara's face contort into an expression of pure malice as the darkness swallowed him whole. Story 3. The Collectors. Gray River stumbled through the forest, blood seeping from the wound in his side. He pressed his hand against the gaping hole, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one more labored than the last. His vision blurred, and he could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of his sight. He was losing consciousness and fast. He had to keep moving. The Collectors were coming. It wasn't the first time he had heard the stories. Tales of the Collectors had been passed down in his family for generations. An ancient, cursed group of hunters that stalked the land in search of their prey. They were known for their brutality, for their insatiable hunger for blood, and for the dark rituals they performed using the skins of those they killed. But Gray River never truly believed in them. He thought they were just stories, legends told to frighten children. That is, until they came for his family. His father had warned him. "If they ever come for you," he'd said, his voice heavy with fear, "don't fight them. Don't resist. The Collectors always win." But Gray River had resisted. And now, his family was gone. His father had been killed first, right in front of him. His mother, Laughing Stone, had been shot in the leg and left to die, her cries echoing in his ears as he tried to escape. And his sister, Running Hair, had been shot point-blank in the face. The Collectors had taken them all, leaving nothing but death and destruction in their wake. He had failed them. Now, it was his turn. Gray River's head spun, and he collapsed to his knees. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He could hear the Collectors closing in on him, their footsteps growing louder, closer, more rhythmic. They had always hunted in packs, and this time, there was no escape. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees twisting and warping as though they were alive, ready to consume him whole. But there was something else. A feeling, an unnatural presence. The air was thick, oppressive, as though it were pressing down on him. He could feel the weight of something ancient, something powerful. The ground beneath him trembled. He looked up, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees. Tall, gaunt, and dressed in black, its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The figure's hands were gloved in black leather, and its boots made no sound as they crushed the leaves beneath them. In one hand, it held a long, jagged knife, its blade glinting in the pale moonlight. Gray River's pulse quickened. He had no time to run. He was trapped. "Don't bother," the figure said, its voice low and gravelly, like the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. "It's over." Gray River's hands shook as he pulled the rifle from his back. He raised it, pointing it at the figure. His finger hovered over the trigger, but something stopped him. He had seen death in many forms, but the Collectors were different. They weren't like anything he had ever encountered. "They won't let you escape," the figure said, taking a step closer. "They never do." Gray River gritted his teeth. He couldn't let them win. He had to fight back, had to protect what little was left of his family's honor. He aimed the rifle once more, but before he could fire, the figure flicked its wrist, and the gun flew from his hands as if it weighed nothing. "Foolish," the figure said. "You think a bullet can stop us?" Gray River's heart sank. There was no hope. "Then what do you want?" he gasped, his voice cracking. The figure stepped forward, its eyes gleaming from beneath the brim of its hat. "You already know the answer to that." Before Gray River could react, the figure lunged at him, its hand wrapping around his throat with terrifying speed. His vision swam, and the world began to tilt as the air was squeezed from his lungs. But just before he lost consciousness, he felt the pressure of the grip loosen. The figure stood back, its cold, unnerving gaze fixed on him. "We don't want your life, Gray River," the figure said, its voice almost a whisper. "We want your soul." Gray River's eyes widened in realization. The collectors didn't just take life. They harvested souls, powerful, ancient souls. Souls that could never be replaced. "Why me?" Gray River whispered. "What do I have that's so special?" The figure's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Your bloodline," it said. "You're the last of them, the last of the old ones. Your soul is more powerful than you can ever imagine." Gray River struggled to stay conscious, but the weight of the figure's words crushed him. He was nothing more than a vessel, an offering for their dark rituals. "No," Gray River muttered, his eyes filling with tears. "I won't give it to you." The figure's smile faded. "You don't have a choice." With a swift motion, the figure plunged its knife into Gray River's chest, just above his heart. The pain was excruciating, but it wasn't death that he feared. It was the cold, relentless certainty that his soul would be taken from him, lost forever. As the darkness closed in, Gray River fought to hold onto the last fragments of his identity. But it was futile. His body slumped forward, and the collectors claimed him as they had claimed so many before him. And somewhere, in the distance, the sound of their footsteps echoed, fading into the night. Story 4. The Haunted Doll, Mandy. In 1991, Miranda had never expected that her life would be disrupted by a seemingly innocent gift, an antique doll that she had found in the attic. The doll, named Mandy, was old and weathered, with cracked porcelain skin and a delicate smile that gave her an unsettling air. At first, Miranda had no reason to suspect that the doll would bring anything but nostalgia, as she placed it in her home as a decorative piece. But that night, everything changed. It was a stormy evening when Miranda first heard it, the soft, eerie sound of crying emanating from the basement. She thought it was the wind, or perhaps the old pipes groaning under the weight of the rain. But as the minutes stretched on, the crying grew louder and more distinct. A chilling shiver ran down her spine as she recognized that the sounds were not coming from the outside world, but from within the house itself. She hesitated for only a moment before making her way downstairs to investigate, flashlight in hand. Her heart raced with each creaking step. When she reached the basement, she was hit by the strange sensation that she wasn't alone. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, her eyes were drawn to the dark corner where the crying seemed to be coming from. There, sitting on a dusty shelf near the window, was Mandy. The doll, which had been in perfect condition when Miranda first laid eyes on it, was now positioned eerily in front of the window, staring directly at her with those cold, vacant eyes. The crying, it seemed, had stopped, but as Miranda approached, she could swear that the doll's lips curled into a subtle, twisted grin. The room seemed to grow colder. Panicked and shaken, Miranda immediately called the authorities, thinking that the doll had somehow come to life. But when they arrived, the doll was as still and lifeless as before. However, Miranda couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, unable to sleep, she heard the same sound again. Faint footsteps wandering around her house, and the softest of whispers, just out of earshot. But every time she checked, there was nothing to be seen. The next day, unable to rid herself of the mounting dread, Miranda decided to donate the doll to the local canal museum in British Columbia, hoping that its eerie presence would be gone for good. She could never have imagined what would happen next. At first, the museum staff dismissed the story as mere superstition. They placed Mandy on display, adding her to their collection of antique toys. But it wasn't long before strange occurrences started to unfold within the museum's walls. Staff members reported missing items. Personal belongings, including lunch, were constantly disappearing, only to be found later in odd places, like locked drawers or hidden corners. The most unsettling part was that these strange happenings always seemed to occur when Mandy was nearby. Visitors to the museum also noticed the inexplicable. As they took photographs of the doll, the pictures would often come out blurry or be obscured by a strange, unnatural light. Cameras that had been perfectly fine just moments earlier would malfunction, and the staff had to reset the equipment time and time again. Despite these technical issues, there was no explanation. Until one night, when the museum's night guard had a terrifying encounter. Michael, the night security guard, had heard rumors of the doll's cursed nature but never believed in such nonsense. That was until he walked past the display where Mandy sat under the soft glow of the museum's lights. As he walked by, he noticed something strange. The doll, which had always been perfectly still, had shifted position. Its head was turned slightly. Its eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, appeared to be following him. He froze in place, heart pounding, but quickly shook off the unease. He continued his rounds, but the sense that something was watching him never left. When he returned to check on Mandy again, the impossible had happened. The doll was no longer sitting upright. It had fallen over, its cracked face staring up at the ceiling as if it were beckoning him closer. With trepidation, Michael knelt down to place the doll back in its proper position, but as he did, he swore he felt the air around him grow colder, and a faint whisper filled his ears. It was a voice, almost like a child's, but twisted with something dark. "You're not supposed to touch me." The next morning, Michael's shift ended early. He never returned to the museum again, and soon after, rumors spread throughout the town about Mandy's unsettling power. The museum's director, faced with increasingly bizarre occurrences, made the decision to lock Mandy in a special, secure display case, one that could not be tampered with. The doll was now on constant display, but the security measures were not enough to calm the growing unease among the museum staff. In the years that followed, visitors to the museum shared strange stories. Some claimed that, when they passed by the doll, they could feel its eyes watching them. Others swore that they had witnessed Mandy's head turning slightly when no one was near her. And some visitors, brave enough to photograph the doll, found their cameras malfunctioning in strange ways. Photographs showing Mandy's face distorted in eerie, unnatural ways, her once blank expression now filled with an unsettling grin. Despite the precautions, the museum staff still felt an unease every time they walked past the display case. The once still eyes of Mandy seemed to grow colder, more calculating with each passing day. And though it was locked away safely, the sense that Mandy was somehow alive continued to haunt the museum. Miranda, now older and wiser, still carries the memory of the night she first encountered the strange doll. When she hears the whispers of the museum's strange occurrences, she can't help but wonder if she had unknowingly opened a door to something far more sinister than a mere antique doll. The truth, perhaps, was far darker than anyone was willing to admit. Story 5. The Doll That Grew Hair. The story begins in a house tucked deep into a narrow alley of a small, sleepy town, where time seemed to stand still. This house belonged to the Fujiwara family, a traditional family that cherished old belongings and held their memories dear. In their living room, amidst old paintings and modest decorations, there was one special item: a doll dressed in a traditional kimono, sitting silently on a shelf, its bright eyes gleaming as though it could see right through everything. This doll was not an ordinary one. It wasn't a mere gift. 10 years ago, on a warm summer night, young Yumi, the little daughter of the Fujiwara family, received this doll from a strange antique shop owned by a mysterious old woman who had handed it over with cryptic words: "Don't let it be abandoned, don't let it be lonely." Yumi didn't understand the warning, but she felt that the doll was somehow special. It had an eerie presence, with smooth, glossy black hair and eyes as dark and bright as jewels, eyes that seemed to hold some deep, ancient secret. Yumi named the doll Okiku, after the name of a girl she had heard about in a bedtime story from her grandmother. From that moment on, Okiku became Yumi's closest companion. The doll was placed in her room, sitting proudly on the windowsill, where Yumi would talk to it, play with it, and even sleep with it in her arms every night. Over time, Yumi began to notice something strange. Every so often, Okiku's hair seemed to grow longer, and the longer it grew, the more lifelike the doll appeared. At first, Yumi thought it was her imagination, but soon she began to realize that the doll's hair was growing at a much faster rate than normal. What was once a short bob was now cascading down Okiku's back in thick, dark locks, curling slightly at the ends. It was an unsettling sight, but Yumi kept quiet, fearing that her parents might take the doll away if they knew. Months passed, and the hair continued to grow. Yumi's mother noticed it one day, while cleaning the room. Her eyes widened as she gently combed through the thick strands, noting how soft and real the hair felt. But no one could explain why the hair kept growing. Some evenings, Yumi would wake up to find strands of hair scattered across her pillow. It was as if Okiku were trying to tell her something important. One night, as a thunderstorm raged outside, Yumi's parents were startled awake by a strange noise coming from Yumi's room. It sounded like soft whispers, like the wind carrying voices. They rushed into the room and found Yumi standing at the window, staring at Okiku with wide, terrified eyes. The doll's hair was no longer just long. It was tangled and wild, the ends hanging down nearly to the floor. Yumi's mother cautiously approached the doll and tried to touch the hair, but the moment her fingers brushed against it, a chill ran down her spine. The room seemed to grow colder, and the air grew thick with an ominous energy. "Mom, it's growing again," Yumi whispered, her voice shaking. Her mother backed away, her face pale with fear. "That's not possible," she stammered. But the reality was clear. The hair was growing, and it wasn't stopping. Over the next few days, the family grew more and more uneasy. They consulted local spiritualists and even had the house cleansed by a monk, but no one could explain what was happening. The more they tried to ignore it, the worse it got. At night, Yumi began having vivid dreams of the doll calling to her, whispering her name in a voice that sounded both familiar and foreign. In the dreams, Okiku would move, slowly turning her head toward Yumi as if she were alive. Finally, one day, in desperation, Yumi's father took Okiku to a nearby shrine. He placed the doll on the altar, offering a prayer to the gods in the hopes of ending the strange phenomenon. But when he returned home that evening, he was pale and silent. He had not been able to leave Okiku there. The doll was gone from the altar, and in its place was a note written in an ancient script that no one could read. Yumi never saw Okiku again, but the memory of the doll and its growing hair haunted her for the rest of her life. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the family would hear faint whispers and the sound of long, dark hair brushing against the walls, as if the doll was still there, watching, waiting. And perhaps, somewhere, the spirit of Okiku still grows. Story 6. Story 6. The Woman from Lemb, the Statue of Death. In 1878, an unassuming limestone statue was discovered in the ancient city of Lemb, in what is now Cyprus. It was an object of striking beauty, an elegantly carved figure of a woman, thought to represent an ancient fertility goddess, dating back to around 3500 BC. Its serene expression, with almond-shaped eyes and a body that seemed to pulse with life despite being carved from stone, led many to believe that it was a symbol of fertility and renewal. The locals, when they first saw it, treated it as a sacred relic, but little did they know that this statue would become synonymous with death. The first owner of the statue was Duke Elfont, a wealthy and respected nobleman. He purchased it for its historical significance, thinking it would make a fine addition to his collection. But the Duke and his family were soon to discover that this statue was not merely an ancient artifact. Within 6 years of bringing it into his home, every member of the Elfont family had died under mysterious circumstances. There was no explanation for their untimely deaths. No illness, no accident, just sudden and inexplicable fatalities that seemed to target each member of the family in turn. The Duke, once a man of great wealth and status, was left alone, devastated, and cursed by the relic he had brought into his home. But the legend of the statue did not end there. The next two owners, Ivor Minucci and Thompson Noel, experienced the same fate. Both families, after taking possession of the statue, perished one by one under the same cryptic circumstances. It was as though the statue's presence was an omen of doom, drawing death to anyone who dared keep it. When Sir Alan Biverbrook, a wealthy aristocrat, became the fourth owner, he remained skeptical of the curse. Dismissing the deaths of the previous owners as coincidences, he brought the statue into his home. However, as if to prove the statue's sinister reputation, Sir Alan, his wife, and his two daughters all succumbed to death in rapid succession, their bodies discovered under baffling and unexplained conditions. The family's tragic end cemented the statue's reputation as an agent of death, a force that brought misfortune to all who came too close. But there was something different this time. The two sons of Sir Alan survived. Against all odds, they lived, though deeply shaken by the deaths of their parents and sisters. Though the brothers were unsure of the statue's true power, they could not bring themselves to keep it any longer. Filled with fear, they decided to donate the statue to the Royal Scottish Museum in Edinburgh, where it remains on display to this day. Even inside the safety of the museum, the statue's influence continued to wreak havoc. Shortly after the statue was placed on display, the head of the exhibition department suddenly died, without warning or cause. The museum officials, despite their reassurances that there was no supernatural element to the statue, could not ignore the pattern that seemed to follow it. Staff members and visitors alike began to avoid it, as if some invisible force warned them to stay away. To this day, the woman from Lemb stands in the museum, enclosed in a glass case, never to be touched. Visitors report that when they stand before it, they feel an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the eyes of the statue follow them, watching them with an almost predatory gaze. The air around it feels unnaturally cold, and some claim to hear faint whispers, almost like a warning, coming from its stone lips. Some say that the statue's curse is not just a myth, but a reality, an ancient goddess, now a harbinger of death, waiting to claim the lives of those who dare to disturb her. The question remains, is the woman from Lemb truly a fertility goddess, or is she something far more sinister? An immortal force, hungry for the souls of the living?